Hello, everyone, and welcome. I think we'll get started right away. We have quite a number of people attending already. We may have some people joining us as we go, but let's get started and keep on our time. So welcome, everyone, to the Building a Digital Government webcast series, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Today's session is entitled Procurement Technology in the Public Sector, and we'll explore how technology can be an enabler to enhancing and making procurement functions better. My name is Jean McClellan, and I'll be your moderator today. I'm a partner in PwC's Canadian technology practice, and for 20 years I've worked with clients to help them achieve their goals by bringing them the best that PwC has to offer. I specialize in large-scale, technology-enabled transformation in the public sector, and I am delighted to be here today to host our speaker, Michelle Groning. Now, before we learn more about Michelle, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. This session will be interactive, so we will have polling questions for you, and we'll leave some time at the end for you to ask questions of Michelle as well. So if at any point during the session you think of a question, please submit that right away. So there's a box. It should pop up on the left side of your screen. Just type in your question there and click the submit button so we have it ready for us when we get to the question and answer period. Again, if you're thinking of those questions, chances are that your colleagues are thinking about them across the country as well, so please be brave, submit those questions. The interaction does make these sessions more rich and relevant for you. And so let's get started right away. We're going to learn a little bit more about each other with our first polling question. What is your role in the organization? So please click on the button that fits best for your profession. So either a procurement professional, an information technology professional, a finance professional, maybe you would be an end user of a procurement technology or other. Don't forget to click that submit button. So we'll just give you a few seconds to, I think everyone may have logged on as well, so let's see where we're at. All right, we have a great cross-section of groups here. So mostly procurement professionals, and that's great. So again, Michelle today will have a lot of detailed information for you, but it's great to see that there are a number of other folks on the line. Again, all of these functions have to work hand in hand when you are implementing procurement technology. So it's great to see that there's interest from all of the elements we've listed here. So today, our agenda is divided into 3 sections. First, Michelle will provide you with her insights from across the country. Then Michelle and I will sit down, have a little bit of fireside chat, and I will ask her a few questions. And then at that point, it'll be your turn to ask her questions as well. Now, at this point, I'd like to take the opportunity to tell you a little bit more about Michelle. We are very, very lucky to have her here today. She's a partner in PwC's Operations Consulting practice, and she leads PwC's Canadian Procurement and Supply Chain practice. She has 25 years of combined industry and consulting experience across the public sector and private sector, and she's designed and implemented multiple procurement and supply chain transformation programs. Her programs have identified and delivered savings in excess of $1.5 billion, that's with a B, billion, dollars in tangible bottom line results. And she's recognized by her clients for learning their culture, their values, and their business priorities. And in her words, her goal is to leave a legacy of value and sustainability for her clients and their teams. So without further ado, I'll pass the baton to Michelle. Michelle, welcome.
Thanks, Jean. Thanks for agreeing to moderate with me today. I appreciate it. So today we're going to cover a few topics related to the subject of procurement technology in the public sector. First, we'll start with a few trends that are driving discussions around procurement technology. We'll have a short discussion about some of the benefits related to these solutions themselves. Next, we'll round out the conversation to discuss a few of the barriers that some of our public sector organizations are facing as they embark on these journeys. And last, we'll share our thoughts on some of the top 3 things that you should focus on to ensure you get the benefits from your implementation. and then we'll round it out with some closing thoughts before we move to the Q&A and have a discussion. I thought it would be important to first, before we jump into all of those topics, just level set on what we mean by procurement technology. So on the slide, you'll see a bit of a life cycle of what we as procurement professionals do for a living. And I'm going to walk through those really quickly and then also describe how the solution providers see and package these solutions. So from the first step, it's all about the data. And for those of us that are procurement professionals on the call, we know that data and information is power to what we do as professionals. So that's all around the spend analysis and forecasting portion of the process. Next, moving around through the sourcing. So these solutions would do everything from the creation, the management, the distribution, the evaluation of a sourcing event. And then the contract process life cycle end to end, so whether that's the authoring of the contract, the workflow and approval of the contract, or the general management of the contract itself. Then moving to the procure to pay cycle, procurement through payment. And so in here we have unique solutions focused on procurement for the unique spend channels, whether that's a complex service or something that would leverage a catalog, and then paying attention to all of the optimization that we can do within the payment function itself around invoicing and payments. And then last but not least, the process of managing your supplier relationships, their information, their performance, and that entire process. So typically, a general theme is that the solution providers package these into two general topics. Spend analysis, sourcing, contract management, supplier management tend to be referred to as strategic sourcing solutions, and procurement and payment tend to be referred to as e-procurement technology. It's not a one-size-fits-all, but generally speaking, that's how they're viewed. I'm going to move to a quick polling question just for context on the audience and who we're speaking with today. And so to answer the question is your organization planning to implement, and where are you in that life cycle? So again, you can click on the one most relevant for your organization and then hit the submit button. We'll just give that a few minutes to get moving. Okay, I think we've had a lot of responses, so we'll go ahead and move to the next slide. So it looks like a number of organizations are either have a project, most have a project underway, or are contemplating that within the next 12 months, with a few not moving on the subject yet. So that's good context to have. Hopefully today's discussion will give you some things that will help you as you continue on your journey or make your move on your journey. So in this section, I'm going to cover a few of the important trends that are driving an increased interest to move forward with procurement technology, in particular within the public sector. Internally, there continues to be budget pressures across the public sector, whether it's core government or in the crowns and agencies and other entities. In many cases, there's also an increased pressure for the procurement function to add value to their internal customers and stakeholders, whether that's in support of budget pressure or in support of other growth plans that many crowns and agencies have. In addition, there's an increased need for efficiency within the function, and that's largely predicated on the need to have the resources focus on those value-add activities, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. From a supplier's point of view, there's an increased focus on reducing costs for those suppliers to work with public sector organizations, and what we often talk about is if they can find ways to do that, then we can find ways for them to pass those savings on to the public sector organizations they work with. There's also an increased focus on reducing some of the barriers that suppliers face when trying to work within the public sector. And then last, and depending on your point of view, the smartphone may be a blessing or a curse. For those of us with children, we debate that. But regardless, there's an increased number of smartphones in the hands of our employees, our citizens, our children, and that's really driving a demand for real-time information and functionality in a mobile environment. Many of the solution providers are actually answering this call by providing mobile access to information and access to approval and workflow functionality. Lastly, in this section, just an increasing important topic is the generation shift. As more millennials enter the workforce, there's an increased expectation for advanced technology. Based on our studies, we project that by 2020, this will be a table stakes expectation, and that's only 4 years away. Compound that with the fact that there's an aging workforce of procurement professionals, and that creates the need for us to engage and excite this new workforce about procurement, and in particular, procurement within the public sector. This is a topic I spend a lot of time working with my public sector clients on. I'm now going to talk about, now that I've talked about a few of the trends driving the topic of procurement technology, I'm going to talk about some of the most common benefit drivers that we see. This slide covers a few of the most commonly discussed benefits. So efficiency is a big focus, so reducing processing time, freeing up the people working within the procurement functions in public sector organizations to focus on the value-add activity. The next, and quite important, being cost savings. So cost savings that can be realized through bottom line cost savings results. And this largely requires, is about how you leverage the technology, but it's also about your people and your processes and what you do around the technology. And we'll talk more about that in a coming section. Another benefit is engagement, so involving the stakeholders, increasing the engagement of stakeholders, giving them user-friendly way to interact with the procurement function and to get what they need to run their business, to do what they need to do on a daily basis. Some of the other commonly discussed benefits include visibility and data transparency to support decision-making and other requirements within the public sector, and also the concept of enabling compliance to contracts through an easy-to-use solution that users can use. Generally speaking, there are two types of benefits, efficiency and cost savings benefits, and these can be defined qualitatively and quantitatively. Efficiency benefits tend to be focused on freeing up our resources so they can then be reallocated to more value-add work. Other quantitative benefits really come from what you do with the information that these solutions provide and how you use your people to go after those savings, and I'll talk more about that coming up in another section. But some examples of that include the ability to aggregate your spend, the ability to leverage the contracting and procurement tools to sustain the savings, things of that nature. I won't spend too much time on this slide, but it gives you a good example of a few case studies of where benefits have been achieved. You'll note that some of the examples are more efficiency-based, while others are clearly hard cost savings-based. And what I find is that the results of an implementation are often based on what the organization's goals were at the outset and how they implemented the program. And I'll talk more about that in a bit. Now for another poll. So for those of you implementing or considering a procurement technology implementation, what are the benefits that you're targeting? And note, you can pick as many answers as you find applicable here in this poll. Just going to give it a moment for people to select a choice. Give it another minute for a few people. Okay, looks like we've had a good number of people respond, so I'll just produce those results. Okay, so interesting. So pretty even across the board. So some targeting, many targeting, improved compliance, collaboration with suppliers. They're pretty evenly distributed. Open collaboration with stakeholders, reducing costs through better spend management, and then efficiency seems to be a huge, huge play, which I would expect to see from a public sector point of view. That's great. Thanks for sharing that. I'm now going to cover a few of the barriers that we see that prevent successful implementation, and this is very much based on our experience with working and supporting our clients with these implementations. Unfortunately, we've seen a number of projects or programs struggle to implement or struggle to get the expected benefits, or they have a budget overrun which impacts their return on investment from the implementation. And in our experience, there's a number of root causes, but there's one overarching theme amongst these, and that's that those projects have been too focused on the technology as the solution to all of the problems. Often the technology is viewed as the solution, and they don't pay attention to the need to change processes or the need to change what their people actually do within the procurement function. And quite often what we see is that processes that are being automated are a bit outdated. They're not aligned with what the technology tools are designed to do, and that is counterintuitive from an implementation perspective. Sometimes we find that the organization structure and the roles are not adjusted to allow the organizations to quickly leverage the technology is another problem. And what we generally see is that if the tool doesn't fit what people need to do or feel they need to do on a daily basis, that shadow processes will quickly creep back in just to make things work. And then that sidelines some of your efforts around the tool. And when that happens, staffing costs to manage those shadow processes can often be more expensive than the original processes themselves. So those are some of the root cause barriers that we see to achieving the expected benefits. Just to go a little bit deeper into a few of the barriers, in particular for the public sector, I think I said a few slides ago that often one of the biggest benefits from using these solutions comes from tangible cost savings, which comes through leveraging the data and the compliance to deliver value. And what we often see is there's no internal shift, or there's a lack of focus on deploying the strategic spend management concepts around the solution. So we don't really change strategically what we do as a procurement function. On the slide, I've referenced a program that I would encourage those of you on the phone to look into, because I find it a really good, unique program. It's a program called Inverting the DNA, and it's part of the UK government's procurement modernization program. And I'd note that they've had some significant advancements in the I'll call it the procurement technology front. So on the slide, what you see is if you look at the gray curve on the slide, what it depicts is the typical focus within a public sector environment before any optimization efforts have been undertaken, which means that there's less time spent on the upfront demand planning, requirements planning, getting the requirements for the procurement right, and also less time spent on the actual management of the contract itself. And the bulk of the effort tends to be spent on the actual procurement process itself. So what this program is targeting to do is to invert that effort, if you will. So spend more and more of the time on the upfront requirements, the strategy, selecting the right procurement vehicle for the type of procurement, and then more time on the back end managing the actual results of the procurement, the contract, the relationship, and the value being delivered, and streamlining that process of the procurement to use the right procurement vehicle to deliver on the benefits. That concept really aligns with what we're speaking about, being the need to focus on changing what we do as procurement professionals. We know we need to select the right procurement process. We know we need to be compliant, but we also need to spend some more focus on some of the value-add activities. Another barrier that is a big topic for me personally of these days is the topic of data security and privacy. And this is really quite prevalent within the public sector. Generally speaking, public sector seems to struggle with this the most due to the need to have data stored within Canada. This conflicts in general with the fact that most of the leading solutions don't actually have data centers within Canada, although many have plans to open these at some point. It's really about needing to understand and dissect what types of data you collect, be it confidential, personal, and really understanding that at a detailed level. What we have seen is that there have been successful arguments that the solution does not actually store personal data, and therefore there have been some move to host solutions from a public sector point of view outside of Canada. This is an ongoing and active discussion, and it's prevalent in many public sector organizations across the country at current. I think what's really important here is to really engage those privacy officers, legal counsel, security, IT early in your project to help you sort through these restrictions, as it does take some time to make a thoughtful decision for your organization. And there are private cloud options that exist to get over this hurdle, which some organizations have actually chosen to deploy.
And the last, I'll call it barrier, that I think is an interesting one, especially within the core government sector, and it speaks to the desire to be able to procure and share this infrastructure across many entities. In practical terms, this is easier said than done because those organizations all have their own current state, their own interpretations of policy, their own divergent processes, their own set of unique stakeholders with unique requirements. The collaborative procurement opportunity makes sense, but it's complex. So it's just recognizing that there's a degree of complexity. There's a lot of research out there generally about collaborative procurement and why some of those tend to fail, whether it's this topic or another topic. And largely that's due to inadequate time spent on the business requirements of those multiple entities, and also an inadequate focus on the program management to see them through to implementation. So those tend to be two of the leading reasons. I'm now going to turn focus to what we believe are some of the key principles to enable successful implementations. To summarize what I'm going to talk about, there's 3 key points. First is that point of reviewing your business processes and taking the steps to modify them where necessary. You heard me talk about it today earlier that you need to engage your stakeholders early and often, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. The more complex your organization is, the earlier you must engage and the more often you must engage. And lastly, on the stakeholder engagement point, your suppliers are really critical to the success of your implementation. If you don't get them on the solution, you won't achieve many of your expected benefits. So in the following slides, I'll go into a bit more detail on these 3 points. First, modifying your processes to take full advantage of the technology and minimize expensive customizations. So here you really need to consider where you need to modify your processes to fit what the leading practice solutions do. And I'm not saying that there's no need to configure the solutions for your entity, but we're trying to avoid the concept of customization. The point is that these procurement technology tools support leading practice processes, and they've been designed to ensure that the features of the solution directly tie to your ability to deliver benefits. If you modify too much from their intended use and customize, you may fail to achieve the benefits that you're looking for. An example of something that we've seen happen is that users of the system don't trust the system, and so they continue to have a paper shadow process. So in the case of where you're retiring from an old system to a new system, that's easier to manage. You can turn the old system off. It's harder to turn things like Excel off that people have a general access to on a daily basis. So you really need to build a campaign to get your users to trust the system, and that's part of your change management strategy. Next, you need to work with your stakeholders and really be invested in their success to drive adoption of the solutions. I can't emphasize this point enough. Engage with your stakeholders early and in a meaningful way. The earlier you hear and understand their requirements and their pain points, the more you can ensure the solution will meet them, and or the more you can understand what your change strategy with those stakeholder groups needs to be. And then lastly, I would emphasize the need to get your suppliers on board and recognize that this really is a journey. A large portion of the benefits of these solutions is predicated on your suppliers working in the solution with you. Your suppliers need to be ready, willing, and able. And if you have one of these items that doesn't fit, you're going to struggle to get your supplier on the solution, and that will mean you'll struggle to get the intended benefits. So you need a strong supplier enablement strategy and plan, and this is really required to be most successful. And to be most successful, this should be aligned to some of your strategic spend management efforts. And what I mean by that is if you have a strategic spend management effort that's focused on streamlining your suppliers, streamlining how you work with your suppliers, streamlining the data you manage with them and making that data more consistent, generally speaking, it's going to be easier for you to onboard that group of suppliers into the solution. So we often find that these 2 topics are quite tied. So the last point I'll make on this slide is this is a journey and it does not happen overnight. So a supplier enablement plan will be over a period of time, needs to be very, very closely managed. I'm going to move into some closing thoughts, but first I'll just end with a bit of a poll. And really the question we have is, did this presentation alter your expectations at all? So did it confirm the path that you're on and what you've been thinking about, or did it
give you some things to relook at your approach and to think about in your approach. I'll just give it a few minutes here for everybody to submit some responses. All right, I think we have a good portion of people that have responded, so I'm going to go ahead and publish those results. Okay, so that's really great. So a lot of people are already thinking about a lot of these topics, and it confirmed what you've been expecting and thinking, so that's good to hear. For those of you that are going to relook at your plan, I'm glad we gave you some insights to think about. So just a quick recap, I think, of the points that I've covered and some key takeaways, I guess, from our point of view. So address your process inefficiencies and try to avoid customizing the technology to do what you do today, and really try to understand why the solution is designed the way that it is, which links to the next point, which is to avoid customization, because these solutions are largely based on leading practice procurement processes, and they're constantly innovating. This is an area of innovation. Think about integration across the organization. So contract pricing is only as good as when your end users use the contracts in the solution. Engage your stakeholders and suppliers, and it's not just about communication and training. It's about change management and having a strategy. And then lastly, have an integrated procurement roadmap. So don't just think about the technology and the elements of that. Think about your strategy, what you do as a procurement organization, the processes that you use, the policies that you have, and the people behaviors and roles that you may have to change to adopt these solutions successfully. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Jean.
Great. And now we're going to start our question and answer portion of this session. So again, we have a couple of questions that have come in, so please do ask your questions. We want to make this as relevant as we can for you, so those questions are a great way for us to do that. Just while people are submitting their questions, I just want to mention again, if you did not see the note, the slides are available in the resource list icon at the bottom of your screen. It looks like a folder with a little down arrow in it, and at that point you can actually download the slides from today's session. So Michelle, I have a few questions for you as we are seeing some of those questions filter in, and again, feel free to submit those questions. Let's start with one. So you covered a lot of material today. Could you, if you had one thing to tell your clients, if you could tell them one thing, what would it be?
I think I would have to say it's the technology is not the single solution to what you need to do. If you don't look at your strategy of your procurement function, if you don't look at your processes, if you don't look at your people and what they're doing, the technology on its own is going to fail to deliver on your benefits. So I think that's got to be my number one thing.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that one. So so in our work, much of what we do, we're always looking for best practice. And I know you've worked extensively with all sorts of public sector organizations across the country. So what are you seeing those clients do well? Are there some best practices that you can share with the group today?
Yeah, so I'll just pick two that come really top of mind. I've seen a really good, solid case of extensive and early stakeholder engagement, which, as we've covered today, is a necessary leading practice. In this example, the organization's still on the journey, but I have a very strong opinion that they'll be very successful in their implementation because they adopted that approach. And the stakeholder engagement started years before the technology was even thought of. I think another best practice I've observed is that procuring any technology solution is complex, and the procurement solution is no different. And so it is a complex procurement. So using the right procurement vehicle to actually go about selecting your right solution provider requires the right procurement vehicle. So I've seen a really good example that's recent and relevant where an approach was used to allow the vendors to have input to shaping the RFP, and that is, generally speaking, a leading practice. So you're getting input so that you're defining the requirements that fit your organization, but being informed as you go through that process. So I think those are two that stand out in my mind. There's probably a number of other ones, but those two stand out for me.
Okay, and so just a follow-up question from the audience, and we've had a few come in. Thank you very much. Keep those coming. So what effective form can stakeholder engagement take?
So the vehicle and how to do that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think I've seen a number of good approaches to that. So there can be open dialogue sessions. There can be canvassing supplier communities for their input to barriers that they're facing that you would want to overcome through that process of implementing. It can be through collaborative forums where you take a roadshow approach to going out and meeting with key stakeholders and understanding some of their requirements and their needs. I think also understanding your procurement professionals and what they do on a daily basis and the things that prevent them from adding the value that most of us go to work every day and want to add. So I think the important point is to take enough time to do that engagement so much and to the extent possible to personalize it so that you are getting that interaction.
That's great. So we talked about best practices. Let's flip that around a little bit. So, so what are the pitfalls that you're seeing some of our clients dip into? So what advice could you give to the participants today? What pitfalls are you seeing that maybe perhaps they could steer around in the future? Where are you seeing clients struggle?
Yeah, so I think three things come to mind for me there. I think often I see my clients and other public sector organizations struggle from not having enough data points on what leading practice is, and therefore they may want to adjust their processes, they just don't know what to adjust. And so having that information available to them about what is leading practice, what other organizations are doing to make themselves successful, they often just lack that information. The other one that I see clients struggle with is this concept of having a supplier enablement plan. In fact, too often I see RFPs released that don't even contemplate the need for a supplier enablement plan. So really missing the boat that suppliers are a key part of this. So I see that as a pitfall or a struggle. And then I think the last thing is where I've seen cases of considering this a little bit of an off the side of the desk implementation. So not dedicating people to make this their job to implement a successful solution would be the other one that I see. And that's not limited to procurement technology. That's based in a lot of large technology transformation projects.
That's great. All right. So next question. So securing appropriate funding always seems to be a bit of a challenge. Do you have any advice for our participants on how to develop a solid budget or how they might secure funding?
Yeah, so I think it's about investing the time to build your business case and making sure your business case covers not only the process efficiency, but also the strategic things your organization can focus on to deliver cost savings. So again, it's about then the benefits are not just the technology, it's changing what your people do and strategically what you do as a procurement function. And when both of those are contemplated in the business case, usually the business case is quite overwhelming and highly self-funding in this area. So it's a huge return on investment when you look at things from that perspective. And typically when the return on investment is high and quick, it's not hard to secure the funding to overcome that.
Great. So a few more. We'll just move right into some of the questions from the audience, and there's some great ones coming in. So any thoughts on small-scale e-procurement? So doing some home building, so to speak. Any thoughts on key attributes that might come in?
So I guess my initial reaction to that question would be there are many solution providers in the market, and some of them do cater to smaller organizations. So before contemplating building it internally or building it like from a homegrown perspective, I'd strongly suggest making sure you've done an appropriate market scan, because chances are there are fit-for-purpose small e-procurement type solution providers that can actually meet the needs. if you do, I guess, choose for some reason to go down that route of building the solution internally, make sure you understand leading practice and what it should do before you undertake that, right? So you want to have the controls at the right points. You want to make sure the solution fits the type of spend you have as an organization, because it's not a one-size-fits-all. So there's rarely one spend channel that an organization can use. A complex service is not the same as procuring an item or a material of some sort.
Thank you for that answer. I think that's helpful. So next question. So regarding best practice to engage suppliers or vendors of the solution in formulating your requirements for the procurement system, what mechanisms would you use? Have you seen RFIs used or something else where suppliers could actually supplier input could get perceived as collusion?
Not if the right collaborative procurement process is used, and there's some very, very large public sector organizations going through this process right now that the listeners on this call could certainly tap into, and I know many of our public sector clients speak to each other. So talk to each other. If the right procurement approach is used, it should not at all lead to any sort of thoughts or issues around collusion or anything of that nature. I have seen, yes, request for information is used quite often and frequent when public sector organizations are trying to learn about what's available out there, and making sure you get a good cross-section of who responds to those RFIs is important. Not just the solution providers themselves, but also the firms that might support those solution providers on these implementations, because they often have a lot of good perspective that they can bring to bear on that. So request for information is a good process to use. A multi-staged RFP process where you can get supplier input from multiple parties, not just one party, on what you might contemplate as you build that RFP. Many organizations also choose to hire a service provider to help them build the requirements of the RFP because they may not know the solution features that they're looking to have requirements around.
Great. Okay. Moving on to some of those security and privacy issues that we talked about. So one concern that one of the audience members has is related to FOIP, and is that if a vendor is required to submit resumes in response to an RFP, then could that be considered personal information? And this may require the data to be in Canada. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. It's actually very topical for our firm and our practice right now, with a lot of responses that we're helping with. And, you know, there's two schools of thought out there. There's one school of thought that argues that resumes are very much personal information. There's another school of thought that says resumes are the property of an organization that might be selling those services or those people to another organization, and therefore not considered personal data. There's also the concept that effectively LinkedIn holds many of our resumes in some way, shape, or form, and therefore can't be classified as personal data. What I can tell you is that it's a very talked about topic. It's very topical right now, and there have been organizations that have successfully navigated and made the point successfully that resumes should not be considered personal information. I also know that in the case of service procurement, the propensity to have personal information becomes more prevalent, and there are ways to configure solutions to avoid having what would be classified as personal data in the solution itself.
Great. So next question actually is about the technology, and particularly technology in the healthcare sector.
Okay.
So what are some of the leading technology vendors or products that you see within procurement? And there's a specific question about SAP and Oracle. And I thought that might be an interesting question for you, because I know that you work not only with some of the standard SAP, Oracle ERP systems, but also specialized procurement technology. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and so you can feel free, given that you're part of the technology practice, to jump in on this with me, but I'll start with some thoughts. So all of the leading solution providers in the market are able to integrate successfully with SAP and Oracle. From a perspective of Oracle, they do have so many solutions that would compete with the leading solution providers out there around the procurement space, and they tend to have been focused on innovation. In the case of SAP, a large reason why they acquired Ariba and also a product known as Fieldglass is because they wanted to adopt leading practice from a software as a service perspective and focus less on some of the solutions they had historically provided, and really focus on those solutions on enhancing the on-the-premise suite of purchasing, I'll call it the purchasing module within SAP. So those would be a few thoughts that come to my mind, but you might have some other thoughts, Jean, from being part of the technology practice.
Yeah, so I think it comes down to your specific needs and requirements. And there are the products and services that SAP and Oracle provide, and in some cases those are a great fit. When you're doing that review of technology vendors for your specific instance, it's good to expand the universe and look into some of the specialized technology that is out there. There are some other vendors that may be better. Now, with respect to the healthcare sector, we're not seeing kind of one vendor dominate the sector. I don't know if you want to talk about that.
No, I'm not seeing one vendor dominate the sector. What I will say is that from a spend classification, there are some unique providers out there that have more of a point of view on how to classify spend, but not viewed as full suite procurement technology solution providers. So not seeing any one domination. Whereas in education, there's been some more prevalence of having some solution providers focus very selectively on that sector. I've not seen that in the healthcare space yet.
Great. Hopefully that helps, and if there's a follow-up question, we're happy to answer it. So another interesting question, so we did talk about the funding part. So how are organizations balancing the funding and collaboration opportunities in their sectors with the need for longer-term thinking and planning and stakeholder engagement? So
is the cost of the funding actually the
yeah.
cost related to stakeholder
engagement?
Yeah,
I think this.
You know, I think it's taking a perspective of, and I will agree it is a challenging item to prove, but I can almost guarantee you that if you look at the history of any really successful technology implementation project, it most certainly included an extensive stakeholder engagement process. So for me, it's the balance of the cost of that up front versus the potentially compound cost of not doing it when you're facing in your implementation. And it's back to the why do some of these implementations fail? And I can guarantee you late stakeholder engagement, and I've seen a number of clients face this, will cost you a lot more than early stakeholder engagement. And keep in mind also that early stakeholder engagement can largely be an internal cost, so not just discounting that it is a cost and an investment, but it can be largely an internal cost, that fact-finding of what's important to your stakeholder, what barriers do they see, doesn't necessarily have to be a cost that's external to your organization, which sometimes makes it easier to justify. But it's just taking that total cost of ownership perspective. If you don't do it, you're going to pay for it somewhere, and it's probably going to be more costly if you start to do that stakeholder engagement during or after your technology implementation.
And I might just add one more comment on that upfront stakeholder engagement can be very efficient and pointed. I know often we work with groups, not only in procurement, but across the technology suite, where they don't want to bother their users, or they don't want to, they're very busy, they don't think they'll care. It's very important to actually have those conversations early on, but they don't have to be lengthy, and you can involve them at pointed times during that initial process so that you keep it very pointed for them. So I would just provide that insight as well.
Yeah, good point.
Okay, we talked about suppliers a little bit. Actually, I'm just going to go on to the next one. Any tips or tricks on how to navigate through that supplier enablement piece?
So I think taking a lens of the categorization of your spend is a really good idea. So there's going to be categories of spend that are easier to enable, that may have suppliers that have been using these solutions themselves with other entities, whether private sector or public sector, and so may be easier for them to adopt it. So really taking that lens of what is the spend area or spend category that I want to enable, and are those suppliers largely already working with these types of solutions, or are they not? Again, going back with that lens of, generally speaking, services and commoditized services and materials are generally easier to enable than complex services, and that's just because of the nature of complex services have more things to consider. There's people involved, there's different and unique commercial structures often involved, and so that just makes them a little bit harder. So typically, good supplier enablement plans take a real spend categorization approach and look for low-hanging fruit, try and get those early wins and lessons learned before you advance to the more complex spend areas. Or take a cross-section, take a highly complex spend area and an easier spend area and run them in parallel. So there's different kind of strategies there.
Yeah. And I think this is a similar question, and I think you may have answered it, but maybe you want to expand on it. So implementing any procurement process would likely take a phased approach. Would you do that by department or by type of goods, or it could be either?
Could be either. However, you have to consider the two sets of stakeholders. There's the supplier community that you're impacting and also the user community that will procure with those suppliers. So I think you've got to kind of look at both lenses before you choose whether a phased approach by department or by supplier. So if you have a supplier used by multiple departments, it may not make sense to take a department approach with that supplier is kind of the key message. So you got to look at it both ways.
Yeah. Okay. Great. And then, when you're looking at general goods, the implementing those categories would be much easier than complex services. So how do you create an e-procurement plan for complex services? What would be the steps that you would look at for that?
So kind of talked a little bit about this, but I'll maybe elaborate. So really understanding the type of complex service and what the leading practice is around managing that spend strategically. Understanding I'll call it the attributes of that spend area. So, I'll talk about engineering services as an example. So do you have multiple contracting structures with engineering services, or have you streamlined and standardized to specific types of contracting structures depending on the type of engineering service and the type of asset that they're working with you on? So I think those would be some of the thoughts I would add around that. I'm not sure if I totally answered that question. So.
If the audience members can certainly ask a follow-up if we haven't got to the root of any of the questions. Feel free. And thank you, just to stop again and say thank you for all the questions that are coming in. They've been great. Keep it going. We still have a few more minutes. So the next one is about vendor credentializing. So if that hasn't taken off in Canada the way it has in the U.S., do you see any trend towards more formalized vendor management or credentializing practices, and particularly in healthcare?
So I think what we mean by this, I'll paraphrase, it's qualification process for a supplier and also then the ongoing supplier management process for that supplier. And I agree, it's not taken off in Canada to the extent that it could from a delivering value to the business perspective. Generally what I'm seeing is there's much lower hanging fruit in many organizations to tackle before that topic becomes readily available to deliver value. So there's typically a lot more hanging fruit to go after around, particularly in health, depending on the area of health that the procurement would be in. There's a lot of standardization opportunities. There's a lot of just better sourcing opportunities within the healthcare sector. And so irrespective of the sector, my general answer would be it's thought of a little later on the roadmap. So cleaning up some of that upfront work around how you source, how you contract tends to be focused on before how then do you manage that supplier relationship and that type of thing. On the qualification side, I'm maybe moving a little bit away from qualification, but information management of the suppliers does tend to be an area that's looked at sooner than later. So being able to work in an environment where suppliers are able to update their information that you need to work with them successfully, be that contact information, entities, business units, products and services provided, that type of thing. The qualification process really should be part of a robust sourcing approach. And that's where that gets dealt with.
Yeah. So one question that's come in is that if you that this individual has seen instances of self-serve corporate online stores for self-serve buying. Is this becoming predominant, and does it work better for certain categories than others?
Usually for more commoditized things that are used widely within the organization, but by a lot of users, because those spend areas tend to be smaller in most organizations compared to the mass amount of spend elsewhere. I'm not seeing any kind of, I think that topic of self-serve buying has been around for a long, long time. I think many organizations have gone after that as low-hanging fruit. I'm not seeing it become more predominant just because it's not a huge spend area for many organizations.
Okay. Great. So one question that's come in is about the e-bonding industry. So are they keeping pace, or is this a barrier when we're talking about individual contractors and managing contract labor?
So I'm not really sure I know how to answer that question completely. I'm not sure what we mean by e-bonding. Do you?
I'm assuming it's maybe the reader can provide some clarification through the question.
Yeah, if you can clarify what you're looking at there, I'm not sure I have a direct answer for that.
Okay, so we'll pause on that question, and perhaps the asker of that question can just provide some clarification. We're happy to get some more context and take a shot at that question, absolutely. So we'll move on to another question just in the interim and start with where there's one more question. So what are you seeing are the major differences between the technology in the public sector versus the private sector?
So I wouldn't say the technology itself is different so much as the ability to make sure that the public sector can be compliant with legislation is a higher focus in the implementation and has to be kind of well thought through. So again, the solution provider itself is not going, the solution itself is not going to solve that problem. It's about understanding the processes, the policies, and how you can keep them compliant. I'd say that's the key difference between public and private sector. The data security and the privacy issues do tend to be a topic, and that's a prevalent topic right now, is can all of the solution providers meet those requirements? And some may be better placed to meet some of those than others.
Okay. Great, we'll move on to, I think we have time for at least one more question.
Yeah, so I see, Jean, that there's been a clarification on the e-bonding. So so the ability to electronically bond that the submissions were compliant, if you will. So I've not particularly run across that being a barrier to a successful implementation in my experience. I think the solution providers facilitate meeting those requirements themselves, so I'm not seeing that be a significant barrier.
Great. Okay, and maybe we'll just do one last question. So we talked about the transformation team early on in the presentation. What's the ideal mix of team members for the transformation team?
So you definitely, you need your technical solution and implementation team, and that can be that's a wide variety of different types of individuals within the organization or within a external provider that might be supporting you. You need strong program management to manage across all the various streams of work within the implementation. So we talked earlier about there being change management, supplier enablement, business process redesign, the technology itself. So being able to manage across those, a strong change management team, again, that integrates across those. A good cross-section of users, whether that's suppliers, business users, or procurement professionals, not necessarily in a full-time capacity, but in a capacity where they're consulted and informed and trained and brought along on the journey. A good team that understands or is responsible for understanding leading practice and what you need to do to modify your processes or what your teams do is important, and that team can also be responsible for looking at your structure and your roles and how they may have to change to meet the requirements of this, what you want the solution to do. So I think those would be the key roles. I don't know, Jean, if you think I might have missed one.
No, I think you've covered them.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think that's all the time that we have for the questions. Again, thank you very much for the participants who did ask questions, lots of them, and really, really great ones that absolutely do hit on some of the key issues that we're seeing with our clients for sure. Michelle, any closing comments now that you've heard those questions from the audience?
No, I think all just really good questions. So I think all the right types of things to be asking as you progress on your journey, you consider your journey. There's no question that's not worth answering or asking, in my experience. And the more you inform yourself, the higher the chances of success on the implementation will be. So thank you, everybody, for attending and for participating and asking a lot of really good questions.
Yes, and again, thanks, Michelle, for spending the time with us today. And again, I will say it again, the audience members really make these webinars. So again, thank you for that, for participating in the polls, for asking those great questions. There were definitely some excellent ones today. I do want to just put in a plug for the next section, or next section in our series. It's coming up on May 10th. And it's entitled Engaging with the Digital Citizen, Customer Experience in the Public Sector. So if you know any of your colleagues that might be interested in this, certainly we can have them attend the session. So just let us know, send us a note, and we can make sure that you have the information for that. And certainly if you want to check us out and that event online, the website is pwc.com/CA for Canada /Living Digital, and that will have a link to all the information on our webinars in this series. So again, thank you to all of my colleagues who helped put on this webinar today, and thank you again for our wonderful audience. We hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks again. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I think we'll get started right away. We have quite a number of people attending already. We may have some people joining us as we go, but let's get started and keep on our time. So welcome, everyone, to the Building a Digital Government webcast series, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Today's session is entitled Procurement Technology in the Public Sector, and we'll explore how technology can be an enabler